November 10th, 1934, 8:46 p.m. The wind coming off the Manhattan streets carried the smell of rain and cigar smoke, the kind that settles into the night like a secret. Outside the club on East 57th Street, men in tuxedos and women in fur coats stepped past the doorman as if he were part of the architecture itself. Inside, the band was playing, laughter rose like champagne bubbles, and money moved invisibly from hand to hand. It was one of those places that pretended to run on glamour when it actually ran on power. Bumpy Johnson arrived without ceremony. He stepped out of a cab, straightened his coat, and paused for a moment to take in the building in front of him. Not because he was impressed, but because Bumpy always took a second to read a place: doors, angles, people. He noticed everything. The club was whites only, officially. Unofficially, exceptions existed for men who had influence, for men who could not be ignored, for men like Bumpy. Least, that was the understanding. The doorman noticed him immediately. Tall, stiff, thin lips, hat pulled low like a man hiding behind a uniform. He held the rope in one hand, the way a judge might hold a gavel, certain of his authority. He had seen Bumpy before. He knew the name. But he also knew the rules as they were explained to him. He believed the rules protected him. He believed they gave him power. He stepped forward, blocking the entrance before Bumpy even reached the top step. This was not unfamiliar territory for Bumpy. He had spent his life navigating rooms that were never built with men like him in mind. He walked with measured calm, not arrogance, not defiance, simply presence. He nodded politely, expecting the doorman to move aside. For a breath, neither of them spoke. The city hummed around them. Cars rolled by. Music drifted from a cracked window. Then, the doorman opened his mouth. What came out was not loud, not shouted, not even angry. It was casual, dismissive. The kind of racism that hides behind politeness while still cutting deep. He told Bumpy he could not enter. He told him men like him did not belong inside. He said it like fact, like gravity, like something he had repeated his entire life without once questioning it. The words hung there, simple and cold. The few people near the entrance slowed down, pretending not to stare while staring anyway. A couple glanced over their shoulders. A waiter paused mid-step. Tension has a specific weight when it travels through a crowd, and everyone felt it at once. The doorman's jaw tightened with false confidence. He believed he had done something brave. He believed he had defended the purity of a place that did not belong to him. What he failed to understand was that he had just attempted to define a man whose life had never been defined by doors. Bumpy did not raise his voice. He did not push. He did not threaten. He simply stood still, eyes steady, expression unreadable. Inside his silence there was calculation, history, restraint, and something else entirely: dignity. He had been called worse. He had faced more dangerous men. But disrespect in public was never about insult alone. It was about message. It was about who controlled the narrative, and Bumpy never allowed someone else to write his story. To understand why that moment mattered, you have to understand where Bumpy Johnson stood in 1934. Harlem was changing. Money flowed through numbers, clubs, rackets, politics, and favors. Italian mob bosses thought they controlled everything. Politicians thought they controlled the mob. The police believed they controlled both. And through it all, Harlem lived between survival and pride. Bumpy had become something rare. He was not just feared, he was respected. He paid rents for families in trouble. He sent food to people who had none. He dealt with the mob when he needed to and resisted them when he had to. He walked between worlds that pretended they could not touch each other. And yet, here he was, on a cold November night, being told he did not belong at the door of a building funded in part by the money his world generated. The doorman tapped the rope again, enjoying his small performance. He repeated himself, harder this time, adding a smug confidence that came not from bravery, but from ignorance. He thought the uniform on his back meant something. He thought the power of the building flowed through him rather than around him. He believed deeply that he had won something in that tiny exchange. Bumpy tilted his head slightly, studying him the way a chess player studies a piece before deciding whether to move it or ignore it. He asked one calm question, not a threat, not a plea, a question designed to reveal something instead of escalate. The doorman answered with the same arrogance, doubling down, making it clear this was no misunderstanding. This was intention. The street felt colder then. A car pulled up. A couple stepped out. They recognized Bumpy immediately and stopped, confused. They greeted him with respect, expecting the rope to drop. When it did not, their expressions changed. Eyes flickered. The doorman saw it too, but he stood firm. Pride is dangerous when placed in the hands of small men. Before that night, Bumpy had already heard stories about this club. He knew which judges drank there, which singers got booked, which deals were whispered over martinis. He did not come to make a scene. He came to talk to someone inside, a quiet conversation, a simple matter. Instead, he found himself face to face with a different kind of problem entirely: ignorance wrapped in authority. The insult itself did not shock Bumpy. What shocked people later was how he handled it. He waited a moment longer, letting the silence stretch until even the doorman felt it. Then he smiled, just slightly, a gesture that unsettled more than a raised fist ever could. He thanked the man. Not sarcastically, not bitterly, calmly. And he turned away, walking back down the steps as slowly as he had arrived. Some watching believed he had backed down. They would learn later that Bumpy Johnson did not back down. He chose his moments. He understood timing the way a surgeon understands a blade. Immediate reaction satisfies ego. Delayed response shapes history. Because the night did not end on those steps. It began there. When Bumpy climbed into the cab and closed the door, the doorman straightened his posture like a man who thought he had won a battle. Inside, Bumpy sat quietly, fingers pressed together, eyes distant, replaying the encounter piece by piece. Not out of anger, but out of strategy. Words have consequences. Doors have consequences. And sometimes the greatest statement is not made in the heat of confrontation, but in what happens afterward. That is the part New York would talk about. The cab rolled north, tires whispering along wet pavement. Harlem glowed ahead like a world separate from the rest of the city, full of noise, music, and movement. Bumpy watched it without speaking. The driver did not ask questions. In Harlem, men learned not to ask. Instead, he glanced every so often at the rearview mirror and studied Bumpy's reflection the way a man studies a storm cloud. By the time Bumpy stepped out, the plan had already begun forming. He did not start with anger. He started with information. Over the next 24 hours, he quietly asked questions. Not about the doorman. The doorman was irrelevant. Men like that rarely created rules. They simply enforced them and believed that made them important. Bumpy wanted to know who owned the building, who financed the club, who sat in the back booths when the lights dimmed and the music covered conversations. Names surfaced quickly: bankers, politicians, a judge, and one particular investor known for cutting deals with the Italian mob while pretending to stay respectable. Bumpy did not need to threaten him. Instead, he sent a polite invitation, a calm request to meet somewhere neutral. A private dining room in Harlem, good food, good whiskey, soft lighting, no witnesses. The man arrived curious, not afraid. He had heard of Bumpy Johnson, but like many men on the other side of town, he only knew the headlines, the rumors, the shadows. He expected loudness, bravado, something theatrical. Instead, he found a quiet table, a warm greeting, and a man who looked more like a professor than a criminal. They shook hands. They sat. Bumpy did not mention the doorman at first. He asked about business, about the club, about investments, revenue, plans for expansion. He listened more than he spoke. The investor relaxed. He liked talking about money. He liked feeling like the smartest man at the table. Bit by bit, he revealed everything Bumpy needed to know. Only then did Bumpy describe what had happened outside the club. He did not raise his voice. He did not curse. He simply laid the story on the table as cleanly as a dealer lays cards. The investor blinked, confused at first, then embarrassed, then cautious. He tried to laugh it off, tried to call it a misunderstanding, tried to place distance between himself and the rule he benefited from. Bumpy let the silence settle. Then he explained what the insult truly meant, not to him personally, but to Harlem, to the people who kept the city running while rarely being allowed past certain doors. To the musicians who filled the club at night but exited through side entrances. To the workers who cleaned the floors yet were never allowed to sit at the tables. To everyone whose money was welcome but whose presence was not. He did not ask for revenge. He asked for change. The investor realized something in that moment. Bumpy was not threatening him. He was offering him a choice. Either the rules changed or the business would suffer in quiet, relentless ways. Deliveries would slow. Protection would slip. Word would travel. Certain names would stop recommending the club. In a city built on connections, absence is loud. The investor agreed, not because of fear, but because he finally understood the stakes. He promised the policy would be rewritten by the end of the week. He promised the doorman would be replaced. He promised the message would be clear. Money did not determine who belonged. Respect did. Bumpy nodded once. The next weekend, the club doors opened to faces they had never allowed inside before. Musicians who once snuck in through service corridors now walked openly through the front. Couples arrived dressed in their best clothes, shoulders back, heads high. Some of the old regulars grumbled, but they stayed. Because music is louder than prejudice, and money is louder still. Word spread through Harlem like a quiet fire. Not because Bumpy bragged. He never did. The story traveled through whispers, through waiters, through cab drivers, through bartenders who watched the transformation with astonishment. People spoke less about the insult and more about how it ended. No broken bones, no gunshots, no spectacle, just leverage. The doorman who had started it all heard about the change from a distance. His name disappeared from the story quickly. In the retellings, he became faceless, a symbol rather than a person. Men like him always believed they stood guard over gates that mattered, never realizing the gates themselves could be moved. Weeks later, a reporter asked casually why certain neighborhoods seemed to be getting along better, why violence had dipped, why tensions had cooled. No one gave him a straight answer. They never would. But privately, among the people who understood how the city worked, there was agreement. That night outside, the club had changed something. Because what shocked New York was not the insult itself. Racism had lived in the city longer than any building, older than any street. What shocked people was that Bumpy Johnson, the man newspapers painted as dangerous, had demonstrated more grace, intelligence, and patience than the men who claimed to represent society. He had not demanded entry out of ego. He had demanded dignity out of principle. In the years that followed, the story became part of Harlem's folklore. Mothers told it to their children as an example of how strength does not always shout. Men repeated it in barbershops, nodding as if they had been there, even if they had not. They loved the ending. They loved that the city's power shifted not through force, but through quiet, relentless strategy. Bumpy never mentioned the incident again. He simply walked into rooms that once would have refused him, took his seat, listened to the music, and spoke when necessary. Not because he needed validation, but because he had already proven a larger point. Doors open differently when they learn who truly owns the street outside. New York, for a brief and rare moment, paused and reflected, and though it did not change overnight, something in its posture shifted. Respect, when enforced without violence, became harder to argue against. And the night on East 57th Street faded into history, not as a story about a doorman or even a club, but as a reminder that sometimes the greatest victories arrive quietly, carried by men who refuse to let ignorance define them. Bumpy Johnson did not simply gain entry, he changed the room forever.